I was 15 when Dad told us God had hidden one safe building at the end of the world. We left Spokane in September 2018, 3 weeks after school would have started if we still went to school. Dad drove us north through British Columbia in a rented truck that smelled like diesel and someone else's cigarettes. Abigail sat up front with her Bible open on her lap. Joey and Matthew and I rode in back with the boxes, our knees pressed against trash bags full of winter coats we hadn't needed in Washington. Dad didn't tell us where we were going until we crossed into Alaska, and he pulled over at a rest stop near the border. He stood beside the truck with the mountains behind him and said Whittier was the place he'd been looking for since before any of us were born. "Most people drive past it," he said. "They think it's ugly. They think it's a mistake." He looked at me when he said it, like I might argue. I didn't. We reached Whittier 2 days later, just after noon on a gray Friday that felt more like November. The Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel was the only way in. Dad had to wait 20 minutes for the traffic signal to turn green because the tunnel was one lane and the trains used it too. While we waited, he explained that the schedule wasn't an inconvenience. It was proof. "Ordinary people see inconvenience," he said. "Faithful people see design." The tunnel was 2.5 miles long, unlit except for our headlights, and so narrow I could have reached out the window and touched the wet rock. When we came out the other side, Whittier was there like something left behind on purpose. The mountains came down to the water on 3 sides. Prince William Sound stretched out gray and cold under low clouds. There were a few small houses near the harbor, a couple of businesses, and one enormous concrete building that looked like a prison or a bunker or both. Dad pointed at it. "Baggage Towers," he said. "Most of the town lives inside." He said it like he'd won an argument I hadn't started. The building was 14 stories tall, dark gray, with narrow windows and a flat roof. It sat at the base of the mountains, like it had been poured into place and left to cure. Dad had already rented an apartment on the 14th floor. We carried boxes up the stairwell because the elevator was slow and Dad didn't trust it. The hallway smelled like old carpet and heating vents. Our apartment was at the end of the corridor, past the laundry room and a maintenance closet with a dented metal door. Inside, the apartment was small and clean and empty. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window over the sink, and a living room with a long wall of windows facing the sound. The floor was laminate made to look like wood. The walls were white and thin enough that I could hear someone's television in the next unit. Matthew ran to the window and pressed his hands against the glass. Joey asked if we could go outside. Abigail set her Bible on the kitchen counter and asked where she should put the boxes. Dad stood in the middle of the living room and said we'd make it work. We did, because we didn't have a choice. Dad gave Abigail 1 bedroom and put the 3 of us boys in the other. He slept on a cot in the living room, where he could see the front door. He used the second bathroom as storage and told us not to go in there unless he said we could. Within a week, he'd turned the apartment into a system. Abigail taught us math and history at the kitchen table. Dad taught scripture in the living room every morning before breakfast. We weren't allowed to leave the apartment without him, and he only left to buy supplies or check in at the Whittier Police Department office downstairs. The police station was inside Baggage Towers on the 1st floor, next to the post office and the clinic. Dad went there once a month to prove we existed. He brought one of us with him every time, rotating so the officers would see all our faces. I went twice. Both times, the officer at the desk asked how I liked Whittier and if I was keeping up with schoolwork. Both times, Dad answered before I could. "They're adjusting," he said. City schools did a lot of damage. They need time. The officer nodded like that made sense. We met Florence Chavez the second week. She lived 3 doors down and caught us in the hallway while Dad was unloading groceries. She was older, maybe 60, with short gray-brown hair and wire-frame glasses. She smiled at Abigail and asked if we'd just moved in. Dad set the bags down and stepped between her and us. We're getting settled, he said. Well, welcome, Florence said. She looked past him at me and Joey and Matthew. You boys look like you could use some fresh air. There's a path down to the harbor if your dad says it's all right. Matthew opened his mouth, but Dad put his hand on Matthew's shoulder. They're shy, Dad said. We're working on it. Florence's smile didn't change, but something in her eyes did. She looked at me for a second longer than she needed to, then nodded and went back to her apartment. After that, whenever we saw her in the hall, she waved and kept walking. Dad spent the fall stockpiling. He drove to Anchorage every 2 weeks and came back with the truck loaded. Rice in 50-pound bags, powdered milk in bulk boxes, canned salmon, canned vegetables, canned soup, iodine tablets, batteries, bottled water, marine plywood, weather stripping, padlocks, hand crank radios, blank cassette tapes. He stacked everything in the second bathroom until the room was full, then started stacking boxes along the living room wall. He made Abigail label every bin with a black marker. She wrote the contents on the lid and the number 1090 on the side. What's that for? Joey asked. The days will need it, Dad said. He didn't explain further. I asked Abigail later while we were putting rice into smaller containers in the kitchen. It's from Daniel, she said quietly. The time, times, and half a time. 1,290 days. Until what? She didn't look up. Until it's safe. I didn't ask what it was. Winter came early. By November, the mountains were white, and the sound was the color of steel. The tunnel schedule changed because of snow. Sometimes we couldn't hear traffic for hours. Dad said that was good. He said the fewer people coming in, the better. He started talking about the Buckner Building, the abandoned military complex on the edge of town. He took me and Joey there once to see it. The building was massive, 6 stories tall and long as 2 city blocks, with hundreds of broken windows and a roof that looked like it was caving in. Dad stood in the parking lot and pointed at it. The government built that, he said. Then they left it to rot. Why? Joey asked. Because they don't care what they leave behind. He looked at me when he said it, like I was supposed to understand something I didn't. On the way back, he stopped the truck near the tunnel entrance and turned off the engine. He pointed at the traffic signal. See that? The tunnel closes every night. It closes in winter. It closes when the trains come through. 1 lane, 1 way in, 1 way out. You think that's an accident? I didn't answer. It's not, he said. He started the engine and drove us home. By December, the apartment smelled like storage bins and canned food. Abigail tried to make it livable. She set up the kitchen table as a classroom and put our books on a shelf Dad built from plywood. She taught Joey and Matthew their times tables. She led hymns on a cheap Casio keyboard Dad bought at a thrift store in Anchorage. She kept the apartment clean and the meals on schedule, and the arguments down to a level Dad could ignore. I read. Mom had left a box of old paperbacks in Spokane, and Dad had packed it without noticing. I found it under my bed a month after we moved in. Mystery novels, thrillers, a few science fiction books with cracked spines. I read them in the bedroom with the door cracked so I could hear if Dad was coming. The books smelled like Mom's house, like the laundry detergent she used and the vanilla candles she lit on Sundays. I didn't tell anyone I had them. Dad said Mom was dead. He told us the story the night before we left Spokane. He sat us down in the living room of the rental house and said Mom had made a choice 2 years earlier. She'd wanted to take us back to Washington after Dad moved us to Alaska the first time, back in 2016. She'd wanted to leave him. She'd wanted to go to the police. Dad said he'd tried to stop her, but she'd walked out during a storm near Portage and never came back. He said the state troopers searched, but the weather was bad, and the roads were dangerous, and sometimes people made choices that couldn't be undone. He said it like it was her fault. Abigail cried. Joey asked if they'd found her body. Matthew asked why Mom's shoes were still by the door. Dad didn't answer Matthew. He just said we were leaving in the morning and we needed to pack. I didn't believe him. I remembered Mom crying in the laundry room of the house we'd rented in Anchorage. I remembered Dad packing her coat into a trash bag and carrying it out to the truck. I remembered Matthew standing in the hallway asking where Mom went, and Dad telling him to go to bed. I didn't say any of that out loud because I'd learned by then that arguing with Dad didn't change anything. It just made him angry. So I kept quiet, and we moved to Whittier, and Dad kept telling the story until it became the only version anyone else would hear. By the time winter really set in, I'd stopped expecting anything to change. Then I started noticing Dad in the hallway at night. The first time, I woke up because I needed to use the bathroom. It was after midnight. The apartment was dark except for the glow from the kitchen nightlight. I got up and walked toward the bathroom, and when I passed the front door, I saw it was open a crack. I stopped. Through the gap, I could see a slice of the hallway and the fluorescent lights overhead. I could hear the hum of the building's heating system and the faint static of something electronic. I opened the door a little wider and looked out. Dad was standing 10 feet down the corridor, facing the wall near the stairwell. His back was to me. He had one hand pressed flat against the wall beside a metal grill I'd never paid attention to before. It was a speaker, part of the building's old intercom system. Dad stood there without moving, his head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something. I didn't say anything. After a minute, he stepped back, looked at the speaker for a few more seconds, then turned and walked back toward the apartment. I pulled the door shut before he saw me and went back to bed. I didn't use the bathroom. I just lay there in the dark and listened to him come inside, lock the door, and go back to his cot in the living room. I didn't ask him about it in the morning. The second time, I didn't wake up by accident. It was late February, a Thursday night, cold enough that the windows had frost on the inside. I'd gone to bed around 10, but I couldn't sleep. Joey was snoring in the bunk across from me, and Matthew was curled up under his blankets in the corner. I lay there staring at the ceiling and listening to the building settle. Around midnight, I heard the front door open. I got up. This time, I didn't wait. I walked straight to the door and looked out. Dad was already down the hall, standing in the same spot as before, one hand on the wall beside the speaker. The hallway was empty except for him. The lights overhead flickered once, then steadied. I could hear the static now, faint but constant, like a radio stuck between stations. Dad leaned closer to the speaker. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear what he said. I stepped into the hallway. "Dad?" He didn't turn around. I walked toward him, slow, my socks quiet on the carpet. When I was close enough to hear the static clearly, I stopped. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a pattern, like something trying to break through. I opened my mouth to ask what he was listening to, but before I could, The static cut out. The speaker went silent. The hallway went silent. Even the heating vents seemed to stop. Dad stood there with his hand on the wall, his shoulders tense, his head still tilted toward the grill. Then he dropped his hand and turned around. He looked at me like he'd known I was there the whole time. "Go back inside," he said. I didn't move. "What were you listening to?" "Nothing. I heard it." "You heard static?" "It sounded like..." "Go back inside, Warren." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I looked at the speaker, then at him, then back at the apartment door. It was still open, just a crack. The light from inside spilling into the hall. I wanted to ask why he was out here every night. I wanted to ask what he thought he was hearing. I wanted to ask if he really believed the static meant something, or if he was just losing his mind. I didn't ask any of it. I went back inside. Dad followed a minute later. He locked the door, checked the deadbolt twice, and went back to his cot. I stood in the kitchen and watched him lie down. He didn't look at me. He just pulled the blanket up to his shoulders and closed his eyes. I went back to bed. The next night, he was out there again. I didn't follow him. I just lay in the dark and listened to the door open and close, like a rhythm he couldn't break. By the time March came, he was spending an hour out there every night, sometimes more. I started hearing him talk to the speaker. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear his voice, low and steady, like he was praying or bargaining or asking for instructions. Abigail noticed too. "What's he doing out there?" she asked one morning while we were folding laundry. "I don't know." "Does he think someone's listening?" I looked at her. She looked tired. She always looked tired. "I think he wants someone to be," I said. She didn't ask again. By mid-March, the stockpile was complete. The second bathroom was packed floor to ceiling. The living room had boxes stacked along 2 walls. The kitchen pantry was full of rice and canned goods. Dad had enough supplies for 3.5 years if we rationed right. He'd written the numbers on a piece of paper and taped it to the fridge. 1,190 days. 4 people. 2 meals a day. He'd done the math. I didn't know what he was waiting for. Then the news started talking about a virus in China, and Dad started smiling. "It's starting," he said one night at dinner. "You'll see." Abigail looked at me across the table. Joey pushed his rice around his plate. Matthew stared at Dad like he was waiting for more. "What's starting?" I asked. Dad didn't answer. He just got up and went to the hallway. That night I followed him again. I waited until I heard the door open. Then I got up and walked out into the hall. Dad was already at the speaker, his hand on the wall, his head close to the grill. The static was louder this time, sharper, almost like voices layered on top of each other. I stepped closer. Dad didn't turn around. I got close enough to hear him whispering. "When?" he said. "When?" The static didn't answer. It just kept going, steady and low, filling the hallway with sound that didn't mean anything. I stood there and watched him. He kept his hand on the dead speaker, his fingers spread against the metal, his ear so close to the grill I thought he might press his face into it. The apartment door was still open behind us. I could see the light from inside spilling across the carpet. I could hear Matthew coughing in the bedroom. I could hear Abigail turning pages in the living room. Dad didn't move. He just stood there, waiting for the static to tell him what came next. The announcement came when I was washing dishes. Dad walked into the kitchen holding his hand-crank radio like it was evidence. His face had that look it got when he'd been listening alone in his room, the kind of calm that made my chest tighten before he even spoke. The lesser plague has revealed the greater one, he said. Abigail was at the table with Matthew, helping him sound out words in an old reader. Joey was on the couch, picking at a loose thread on the cushion. Everyone stopped. Dad set the radio down. There's a sickness moving through enclosed towns, carried by salt fog from Prince William Sound, by the shared air systems inside public buildings. He looked at each of us in turn. Whittier is about to be sealed by the state. The tunnel will never reopen. Beggish Towers will become either an ark or a tomb. I didn't say anything. None of us did. Outside the window, sleet tapped against the glass like someone asking to be let in. Tonight, Dad said. He started in my room. I heard the drill whine, then the bang of the first screw going through plywood into the window frame. By the time I got to the doorway, he'd already covered half the glass. The room went gray, then dim, then dark, except for the overhead light. Dad, I said. He didn't look up. Go help your sister. Abigail was in the living room, holding Matthew's hand, while Dad moved to the next window. Joey stood by the couch, watching the plywood go up like he was waiting for someone to tell him it was a joke. It took Dad 2 hours to cover every window in the apartment. He worked without talking, moving from room to room with the drill, the screws, and a stack of marine plywood he'd been storing in the coat closet for weeks. When he finished, the apartment felt smaller. The air tasted flat. Then he went to the front door. He pulled a roll of rubber stripping from a plastic bin and pressed it along the doorframe, sealing every gap. He bolted a steel bar across the door, the kind you'd use to secure a shipping container. He tested it twice, pushing hard enough that the frame groaned. Finally, he pulled the key off the hook by the door and hung it on a cord around his neck. Abigail made a small sound, like she'd started to say something and swallowed it. Dad turned to face us. No one touches this door. No one opens a window. No one goes outside. He looked at me when he said it. The air out there isn't clean anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. How long? I asked. As long as it takes. That night, I found out he'd already disconnected the internet, cut the cable, pulled the batteries from every phone, every flashlight, every remote. The only devices left running were his radios, the No-A weather radio on the kitchen counter, an old portable television in the living room that had sound but no picture, and the dead maintenance speaker mounted in the hallway wall. Dad said those were enough. He said we didn't need the world's voice anymore, just the ones that mattered. The next morning, he called us into the kitchen and explained the number. 1,290 days, he said. He had a calculator, a Bible, and a notepad covered in his handwriting. Daniel was told to wait. We'll do the same. Abigail looked at the notepad, then at Dad. That's 3.5 years. The time of concealment ends when the air outside is judged. He pushed the notepad toward her. Write it on the bins, everyone, so we remember what we're counting toward. She did. I watched her kneel in the pantry room with a black marker, writing 1290 on the lids of the storage bins, the sides of the water jugs, the tops of the rice sacks. Her handwriting got smaller as she went, like she was trying to make the number take up less space. When she finished, I asked Dad how he'd picked that number. I didn't pick it, he said. It was given. I didn't ask by who. Abigail tried to make it livable. She turned the second bedroom into a classroom, with the old reader, a box of workbooks, and a dry erase board she'd found in the closet. She moved all the food into the third bedroom and labeled the shelves by type: cans, bags, boxes, powders. She told Joey and Matthew they could race socks in the hallway as long as they didn't knock anything over. For a while, it almost worked. Abigail led hymns on a cheap Casio keyboard Dad had bought at a thrift store in Anchorage. Her voice was soft, but steady, and Matthew liked to hum along even when he didn't know the words. Joey kept score for card games, writing tallies on scraps of paper he saved in an old envelope. Matthew built towns out of empty cans, stacking them in careful rows and giving each stack a name. I read. Mom had left a box of paperbacks in the coat closet, books she'd probably meant to donate or throw away. I pulled it out the second week and started working through them one by one. Some were romances with bent covers. Some were thrillers with pages missing. I didn't care. They were voices that didn't come from Dad, or the radio, or the dead speaker in the wall. We fell into a routine. Dad checked the radios every morning and every night. Abigail taught lessons in the classroom. Joey and Matthew raced socks and built towers and argued about the rules. I read and helped Abigail cook and tried not to think about how the windows were covered or how the door was barred or how the key hung around Dad's neck like a piece of him. But even in those first months, when the system almost functioned, I noticed things. The apartment smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, just wrong. Like wet concrete or old water, or something that had been sealed up too long. I mentioned it to Abigail once, while we were washing dishes. "Do you smell that?" I asked. She paused, her hands still in the soapy water. "Smell what?" "I don't know. Like dampness. Like the walls are sweating." She looked at me, then at the covered windows, then back at the dishes. "It's probably just the heat. The vents are working fine." But I checked the vents. Dad checked them every day. He said nothing from outside could get in as long as the seals held. I smelled it anyway. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with Mom's box of paperbacks on the floor beside me. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the space heater and the occasional creak of someone shifting in their sleep. I opened the next book in the stack, a mystery with a cover that showed a woman standing in front of a burning house. The smell was stronger that night, wet concrete and something else, something I couldn't name. I looked at the covered windows, the sealed door, the dead speaker in the hallway. I thought about the number Abigail had written on the bins. 1,290 days. I did the math in my head. If Dad was right, we had 3.5 years left. If he was wrong, I didn't know how we'd ever get out. I sat there with the book in my lap, breathing air that smelled like wet concrete, and tried to convince myself that the system would hold. I woke to tapping. The apartment was black. No moonlight came through the plywood. The clock had stopped weeks before. I lay still and listened. Tap, 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 tap. Metal on metal. Quiet but rhythmic. Coming from the living room, I sat up. The air smelled like wet concrete again. The smell that shouldn't have been there because all the windows were sealed. I pulled on a sweatshirt and stepped into the hallway. The floor was cold under my socks. The tapping stopped. I waited, counted 5 breaths. Then I heard something else, whispering. I moved toward the living room, keeping one hand on the wall. The darkness was total. I couldn't see my own fingers, but I could hear Matthew's voice ahead of me, low and careful, forming words I couldn't make out. He paused. Silence. Then he whispered again. Another pause. Longer this time. I took 2 more steps and stopped at the edge of the living room doorway. Matthew was kneeling beside the baseboard heater against the far wall. I couldn't see him, but I knew the shape of him in the dark. The size of a 7-year-old folded down small. He had his face close to the metal fins. His hands rested on the floor. He whispered something that sounded like a question. Silence. Then he nodded. I don't know how I saw the nod in that darkness, but I did, or I felt it happen. Matthew, I said. He turned, not toward my voice, toward me. His head swiveled and his face pointed straight at the hallway where I stood, even though there was no light, even though he'd always been afraid of the dark and never walked anywhere at night without Abigail holding his hand. He looked right at me. The man in the warm wall knows Deborah's real name for Aiden, Matthew said. His voice was flat, not scared, not excited, just reporting. I opened my mouth, closed it. Go back to bed, Leaf, Matthew said. I did. The next afternoon, Joey and Matthew raced socks down the hallway. Abigail had taught them the game months ago, back when she was still trying to make the apartment survivable. You sat at one end of the hall, took off your socks, balled them up, and rolled them as hard as you could toward the front door. Whoever got closest won a point. Abigail kept score on a notepad with a chewed pencil. I sat on the couch with one of Deborah's old paperbacks, pretending to read. Really, I was watching Matthew. He looked normal, small and blonde and bored. He rolled his sock without much effort, and it stopped 3 feet short of the door. Joey laughed and said he could beat that with his eyes closed. Joey wound up and threw hard. His sock shot past the door and smacked the wall. That's out of bounds, Matthew said. No, it's not. Closest to the door wins. That's the rule. You have to stay in the hallway. I did stay in the hallway. Matthew stood up. Joey stood up too. They were almost the same height. Joey was 2 years older, but Matthew had grown faster during the sealed months, like the apartment was feeding him. You're cheating, Matthew said. I'm not cheating. You're just mad you lost. Matthew smiled. Then he shoved Joey hard into the pantry shelves. Joey's head hit the corner of the second shelf. The sound was wood on bone, sharp and clean. Joey dropped. Blood welled up through his hair and ran down his temple. He sat on the floor with his mouth open, too surprised to cry yet. Matthew turned and looked straight at me, still smiling. I understood. He knew I'd been listening last night. He knew I'd heard him whisper, and he wanted me to know that he knew. Abigail came running from the bedroom. She knelt beside Joey and pressed a dish towel to his scalp. Joey started crying. Dad came out and asked what happened. Matthew said Joey had tripped. I didn't say anything. Within weeks, I heard the voice myself. It came through the baseboard heaters first, a low hum that turned into syllables, then through the bathroom vent while I brushed my teeth, then through the dead building speaker beside the front door, the one that hadn't worked since we moved in. The voice was patient, almost human, but the words slid together like someone playing 3 radio stations at once and letting them overlap. I couldn't make out full sentences, just pieces. Tunnel remains, advised to maintain. The air is... Matthew answered it in the same mashed together speech. I heard him one morning in his bedroom, talking to the heater in a language I didn't recognize. Not English, not anything, just sounds shaped like words. He saw me standing in the doorway and switched back to English without breaking rhythm. It says you're listening again, he said. I backed out of the room. I waited until Dad was alone in the kitchen, boiling rice on the camp stove. The apartment smelled like propane and old water. Someone is talking through the walls, I said. Dad didn't turn around. Matthew hears it, I said. I hear it too. It's coming through the heaters and the vents and the speaker by the door. Dad stirred the rice. It's saying things about the tunnel and the air, and he hit me, open palm across the side of my head. My ear rang and my vision went white for a second. I stumbled back against the counter. Do not, Dad said, try to make this family doubt the Ark. He left the rice on the stove and walked into the hallway. I heard him stop by the front door, heard him stand there. For almost an hour he didn't move. I stayed in the kitchen. The rice burned. I turned off the stove and scraped the pot into the trash. My ear still rang. When Dad finally came back, he looked tired. Older. He sat down at the table and put his hands flat on the surface. The Lord sometimes uses wires, he said, because men have forgotten burning bushes. The No AA radio started after that. We'd been listening to it every night because Dad said it was the only clean signal, the only broadcast the contaminated stations couldn't corrupt. It gave us weather updates for Prince William Sound and marine warnings, and sometimes tide schedules. Boring and factual and safe. Then it changed. One night the weather report ended and the announcer kept talking. Anchorage hospitals have begun emergency closure procedures due to overcrowding. All non-critical patients are being turned away. Residents are advised to shelter in place and avoid travel to the municipality. Dad leaned forward. The Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel has been closed indefinitely. State transportation officials report the tunnel is blocked by abandoned vehicles. Motorists who entered from the Portage side have not responded to radio contact. Abigail looked at me. I shook my head. Alaska Railroad service has been suspended between Seward and Anchorage. The last train to depart Portage did not arrive at its scheduled destination. Witnesses report passengers exhibited severe respiratory distress and ocular hemorrhaging. The Railroad Authority has issued a shelter advisory for all communities along the line. Joey said, "What's ocular hemorrhaging?" "Bleeding from the eyes," I said. Matthew smiled at the radio. Residents of coastal communities are advised to avoid unfiltered exposure to marine air. Multiple individuals in Whittier have been reported walking into the water at Passage Canal. Search and rescue operations have been suspended due to hazardous conditions. The broadcast ended. Static filled the room. Dad turned the radio off. He sat back in his chair and folded his hands. "You see?" he said. "You see what I saved you from?" But something was wrong with the broadcast. I noticed it the second night. The announcer said Anchorage hospitals had exhausted all ventilator supplies. Then he said the tunnel closure had been extended because state engineers cannot assess the integrity of the Baggage Tower ventilation systems. The Baggage Tower. Not Baggage Towers. Not the building. The tower. Singular. No one in Whittier called it that. The third night he pronounced Seward wrong. Seaward, with a hard pause in the middle. And he called Girdwood Girdwood, like two separate words. I'd driven through Girdwood with Deborah once, years ago. She'd pointed at the sign and told me it was named after a man, not a forest. The locals said it like Girdwood, fast and slurred. Everyone knew that. But the radio announcer didn't. He was reading names he'd never heard spoken aloud. I wanted to tell someone, but Joey was too young to understand, and Abigail was too scared to question anything that made Dad feel right. And Dad was listening to the broadcasts like they were scripture. So I kept quiet. The reports kept coming. Every night the NOAA voice described new closures, new casualties, new quarantine zones. The tunnel would never reopen. The railroad was gone. The Coast Guard had abandoned Prince William Sound. Anchorage was burning. Portage was empty. The air itself was sick. And every night Dad made us gather around the radio and listen. After one particularly detailed broadcast about contaminated fog rolling in from the sound, Dad stood up and told us to tape towels over the vents. We did. Every vent in the apartment got covered with duct tape and old bath towels. The air got stale fast. The smell of wet concrete grew stronger. Matthew watched from his bedroom doorway. When we finished, Dad walked past him into Matthew's room. He came out a minute later holding the towel we'd just taped over Matthew's vent. "This one stays open," Dad said. Abigail looked at me. I looked at the floor. "Why?" Joey asked. Dad put his hand on Matthew's head. "The wall needs to breathe," Matthew said. Joey opened his mouth, closed it, went back to his room. Matthew changed after that. He stopped being loud, stopped needing Abigail to tie his shoes, or cut his food, or check under his bed for monsters. He became quiet and watchful and precise. He knew things he shouldn't have known. One afternoon, Abigail was looking for the extra crackers she'd hidden in her sewing kit, the ones she'd saved from her last 3 rations so she could give them to Joey and Matthew when they got too hungry. She tore the kit apart, checked under her mattress, searched the pantry. Matthew walked up behind her and said, "You ate them 2 nights ago when you thought we were asleep." She hadn't. I knew because I'd seen her hide them, but she stopped looking. A week later, Joey showed me the tally marks he'd scratched under his mattress. 1 mark for every day we'd been sealed inside. He was trying to keep count because Dad wouldn't tell us how much time was left. That night at dinner, Matthew said, "Joey's been counting. He's up to 143. He thinks Dad is lying about the number." Joey went white. Dad stared at him. Didn't say anything. Just stared. Joey looked at me for help. I couldn't give him any. Matthew kept eating. One night I found Matthew standing in the bathroom, staring at the vent above the toilet. The towel we'd taped over it was hanging loose on one side. "What are you doing?" I said. "Listening." "To what?" "Deborah." I went cold. "She didn't walk into the storm," Matthew said. He didn't look at me, kept his eyes on the vent. "She went where voices go when doors close." "What does that mean?" He turned, looked straight at me with those wide blue eyes. "You know what it means, Leaf." I left the bathroom, shut the door, stood in the hallway with my hands shaking. He was 7 years old. It got worse. Matthew started knowing things about all of us, private things. He knew when Joey cried at night, knew when Abigail whispered prayers in the bathroom, knew when I stood by the plywood windows and imagined ripping them down. He didn't tell Dad most of it. He just let us know that he knew. Abigail started doing Matthew's chores without being asked. Joey stopped talking during meals. I kept my distance and tried not to think too hard about anything when Matthew was in the room. But Matthew wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Dad. Dad had started looking at Matthew the way he used to look at his Bible. Like Matthew was proof of something. Like everything Dad had done, all the sealing and the hoarding and the years of waiting had been leading to this moment when his youngest son could hear the voice of God coming through the heating vents. It happened at dinner on a Tuesday. We were eating rice and canned salmon at the kitchen table. Dad was talking about Revelation again, about the 144,000 chosen ones, and how Big Itch Towers was the last ark, and how we'd been saved because we'd had faith when others had doubt. Matthew wasn't eating. He was staring at his plate. Then he stood up on his chair. Abigail said, "Matthew, sit down." He didn't sit down. His eyes rolled back, all white. His mouth opened. And when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. It was the voice from the hallway speaker, the voice from the heaters and the vents and the no AA radio. Amplified through a child's chest. The false air will test the seals at 8:17 p.m. Joey knocked his fork off the table. Matthew's eyes rolled forward. He blinked once, looked at Dad. "Did you hear?" Matthew asked. Normal voice now, small and curious. Dad checked his watch. It was 7:54. "Everyone sit still," Dad said. "Do not move. Do not open any doors. Do not touch the windows." We sat. The minutes crawled. I watched the second hand on Dad's watch tick forward. Joey was breathing too fast. Abigail had her hands folded in her lap like she was praying. Matthew smiled at his plate. 8:15, 8:16, 8:17. Every radio in the apartment shrieked, all at once. The no AA radio on the counter, the hand crank radio in the hallway, the old portable television with no picture. They screamed like emergency broadcast signals layered on top of each other. Feedback and static, and something underneath that sounded like voices talking backward. The hallway speaker crackled, popped, started broadcasting the same scream. The lights flickered, once, twice. Then they strobed so fast the kitchen looked like it was shaking. The fluorescent bulb above the table flared white and blew out. Glass rained down on the rice. The breaker tripped. Everything went dark. The radios cut off. The speaker went silent. The apartment filled with the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I heard Dad breathing, heard Joey crying, heard Matthew humming. Then I heard Dad move. A chair scraped, footsteps, a body hitting the floor. When I found the flashlight and turned it on, Dad was on his knees in front of Matthew's chair. Matthew was still standing, still smiling. Dad reached up and took Matthew's hands. "You," Dad said. His voice cracked. "You are chosen." Matthew looked down at him. "I know," Matthew said. Food started disappearing from the bins marked 1090, 3 weeks after Dad declared Matthew chosen. At first, Dad blamed poor ration discipline. He made us recount the cans every morning, kneeling in the pantry with the flashlight while he stood behind us and watched our hands. The numbers never matched. 6 cans of salmon one day, 4 the next. A bag of rice opened and half gone. Powdered milk dumped into the sink. Dad said we were eating in our sleep. He said the bad air made people forget what they'd done. But I knew Matthew was taking it. Joey knew too. He found the proof one afternoon while Matthew was in the bathroom and Dad was listening to the hallway speaker. Joey grabbed my wrist and pulled me into Matthew's room without speaking. He pointed under the bed. I knelt and looked. Torn labels were stuffed behind the bed frame, dozens of them, peeled from cans and folded small. Joey's face was red. He whispered, "We should tell everyone." I shook my head. Dad won't believe us. "He has to. Look at this." Joey pulled out 3 more labels, smoothed them against his knee. Salmon, beans, peaches. "Matthew's been stealing for weeks. Dad will say we planted them." Joey's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to hit something. "Then we wait." "Wait for what?" "Sunday prayer." Joey folded the labels back into his pocket. "Dad has to listen under God's eye." I didn't think that was true anymore, but Joey believed it, so I didn't argue. Sunday came. We knelt in the living room like always, the 5 of us in a line facing the boarded window. Dad stood behind us with his Bible open. The apartment smelled like burned rice and the bucket we used when the toilet backed up. Matthew knelt at the end, his hands folded, his eyes half closed like he was already somewhere else. Dad started the prayer. He thanked God for the seals, for the concealment, for keeping us faithful while the world outside bled into the water. His voice filled the room. I could feel Joey shaking beside me, waiting for the right moment. But Matthew spoke first. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask permission. He just opened his eyes and said, "Dad, Joey has been stealing food for weeks." The prayer stopped. Dad's voice cut off mid-word. Joey went rigid. Matthew kept talking. His voice was calm, flat, like he was reading from a list. "He feeds it into the bathroom vent so the unclean air will spare him. He thinks if he gives it enough, it won't take him like it took Mom." Joey stood up fast, his knees cracking. "That's a lie." Dad stared at Matthew. "You saw this?" "I heard him." Matthew tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "The wall told me where to look." "No." Joey's voice broke. "No. Matthew put those labels under his bed. I found them. Ask Leaf, he saw them too." Dad turned to me. His face was hard, waiting. I opened my mouth. I wanted to tell him Joey was right, that we'd found the proof together, that Matthew had been stealing since the night Dad declared him chosen. But Dad's hand was already moving toward his belt, and I knew what happened when you called Matthew a liar now. I said, "I don't know." Joey looked at me like I'd shoved him. Dad walked past us into Matthew's room. We heard him tearing the bed apart, dragging the mattress off the frame, pulling drawers open. He came back holding nothing. "There's nothing under his bed," Dad said. "Because he moved them," Joey said. His voice was too loud, desperate. "He knew we found them, so he moved them." Dad walked into Joey's room. We heard the same sounds. Mattress, drawers, the scrape of something heavy across the floor. When Dad came back, he was holding 3 empty cans. Salmon. The labels matched the ones in Joey's pocket. "These were under your mattress," Dad said. Joey's face went white. "Matthew put them there." "When?" "I don't know. This morning. Last night. Whenever I wasn't looking." Joey pulled the torn labels from his pocket, held them out. "Look. These came from his room. We found them together." Dad took the labels. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at me. "Did you see Matthew put these under Joey's bed?" "No." "Did you see Joey take these from Matthew's room?" I hesitated. "Yes." Dad dropped the labels on the floor. He looked at Joey like Joey had already stopped being his son. "You stole food. You hid the evidence under your own bed. Then you tried to blame your brother by planting torn labels in his room." "No." Joey's voice cracked. "Dad, please. Matthew's lying. He's been lying since the fever. You know he has." "Matthew was chosen," Dad said. "The Lord doesn't speak through liars." "He's not chosen. He's just..." Dad grabbed Joey by the arm and dragged him into the hallway. Joey tried to pull free, but Dad was too strong. He opened the hall closet, shoved Joey inside, and slammed the door. The lock clicked. Joey pounded on the door from the inside. "Dad, please. I didn't steal anything. Please." Dad turned to the rest of us. His face was calm again, like he'd just finished a difficult repair. "He'll pray tonight. In the morning, if he's ready to confess, we'll let him out." Matthew stood up from his knees. He brushed dust off his pants and walked back to his room without looking at the closet. Abigail was crying without sound, her shoulders shaking. I didn't move. Joey kept pounding. His voice got quieter. By the time Dad turned the lights off for the night, Joey was just whispering through the door, asking God to make Dad listen. I woke up to silence. The apartment was gray with early light, the kind that came through the cracks around the plywood. I sat up. The closet door was still shut. I couldn't hear Joey anymore. Dad was already in the hallway, standing in front of the closet with the key in his hand. Abigail stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself. Matthew sat on the floor near his bedroom door, watching. Dad unlocked the closet and pulled the door open. Joey was on the floor, curled on his side. His eyes were half open. His mouth was open too, like he'd been trying to say something when he stopped. Gray dust covered his hands and face. It looked like the dust that came out of the heater vents, fine and chalky and wrong. Dad knelt beside him. He pressed 2 fingers against Joey's neck, held them there, then pulled his hand back. His heart failed, Dad said. He didn't look at any of us. Lies weakened the body. Abigail made a sound like she'd been punched. I pushed past Dad and knelt next to Joey. His skin was cold. I touched his hand, turned it over. Gray dust was packed under his fingernails, thick and damp, like he'd been clawing at something wet. I looked at the inside of the closet door. 3 bloody crescent marks were gouged into the wood, deep enough to splinter. He was trying to get out, I said. Dad stood up. He was trying to escape judgment. He was 12. Dad's hand shot out and grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He lied. He stole. He tried to turn this family against itself. The Lord does not spare the faithless just because they're young. I looked at Matthew. He was still sitting on the floor, his face blank, his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for instructions. Matthew planted those cans, I said. Dad's grip tightened. Do not make your brother's mistake. He let go and stepped back into the living room. He told Abigail to bring the shower curtains from the sealed bathroom, the one we hadn't used since the water came back wrong. She didn't argue. She walked like her legs weren't working right, like something inside her had come loose. Dad wrapped Joey in the plastic curtains, folding the edges over his face and hands, taping the seams with duct tape from the pantry. He said the contaminated world could not receive a faithful body. He said Joey had to stay inside until the concealment ended, because burial in poisoned ground was the same as desecration. He carried Joey into the sealed second bathroom and laid him in the tub. Then he shut the door and locked it. For 2 days, no one talked about the smell. It started faint, like old meat left in a warm room. Then it got thicker, sour and sweet at the same time, and it seeped under the bathroom door no matter how many towels Abigail stuffed into the gap. The apartment was small enough that the smell reached everywhere. It got into the pantry, the bedrooms, the couch cushions. When I tried to eat, I tasted it on the back of my tongue. Matthew didn't seem to notice. He sat by his heater and whispered into the fins, pausing like always, listening to answers the rest of us couldn't hear. On the 3rd day, Dad couldn't stand it anymore. He opened the sealed bathroom, covered his mouth with his shirt, and dragged Joey out still wrapped in the shower curtains. The plastic had fogged on the inside. I could see the shape of Joey's face through it, blurred and gray. Dad carried him to the laundry area, the narrow space behind the kitchen where the washing machine and dryer were stacked. I'd been in that space 100 times. I'd never seen a service panel, but Dad knew where it was. He set Joey down on the floor and pulled the washing machine forward, grunting with the effort. The machine scraped across the linoleum, loud enough to make Abigail flinch in the kitchen doorway. Behind it, low on the wall, was a metal panel about 2 feet square. It was painted the same color as the wall, and the screws holding it in place were rusty and old. Dad pulled a screwdriver from his pocket. He'd been carrying it all morning. He unscrewed the panel, working slowly, and set it aside. Behind it was a vertical shaft, narrow and dark, dropping straight down into the building. I could smell concrete dust and something else, something damp and metallic, like the air that came out of the vents at night. Dad picked Joey up and pushed him into the shaft feet first, folding his legs into the space. The bundle fit, barely. Dad had to angle Joey's shoulders and press hard to get him past the opening. I stepped closer. "What is that?" "Maintenance void." Dad's voice was strained. He was still pushing. "They used it for old pipes and wiring. It goes all the way down." "Where does it go?" "Down." I looked past Dad into the shaft. It was too dark to see the bottom. I couldn't hear anything down there. No water, no wind, just a faint hum like the sound the building made at night when everyone was supposed to be asleep. Dad shoved Joey's shoulders into the void. The plastic crinkled. For a second, the bundle caught on something, stuck, and Dad had to brace his foot against the wall and push harder. Then something pulled. I saw it. Dad's hands were still on the bundle, still pressing down, but the bundle moved up. Just an inch, then two, like something below had reached up and grabbed it. Dad's face went tight. He pushed harder, trying to force Joey down, but the bundle slid up again, smooth and fast, and then it jerked out of his hands completely. The shower curtain bundle disappeared into the dark. Dad stumbled back, breathing hard. He stared at the opening. We all did. I waited for a sound, a splash, a thud, anything to tell us where Joey had gone. There was nothing. Matthew stood in the kitchen doorway behind Abigail. He wasn't blinking. He was smiling, just a little, like he'd been waiting for this all day. The shower curtain bundle slid out of Dad's hands and disappeared into the vertical maintenance void. The apartment changed after Joey disappeared. It wasn't all at once. First, it was just the lights. The bulb in the kitchen popped one morning while I was dividing rice into bowls. The hallway fixture died that afternoon. Dad replaced them both, but they lasted maybe an hour before they blew again. Meanwhile, Matthew's room stayed bright. His bulb never flickered. It burned steady and white while the rest of the apartment went dim. Then the bathroom vent started dripping. Brown water. It came down in slow drops that stained the tile, and when I climbed on the toilet to look, there was nothing above us but concrete. No pipes, no leak, just the vent cover and the dark square behind it. I told Dad, and he said condensation sometimes pooled in old ducts, but the drops kept coming, and after a week, the bathroom smelled like rust and something else I couldn't name. Something that reminded me of the maintenance void. The heaters were worse. They'd always made noise, pings and clanks when they heated up or cooled down, but now they sounded different, rhythmic. I'd be lying in bed at night and hear 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 fast ones, over and over. It took me too long to realize the pattern matched Matthew's fingers when he sat by the baseboard in the living room. He'd tap the metal fins with his nails, pause, tap again. And somewhere else in the apartment, the heater would answer. Dad didn't notice. Or he noticed and called it thermal expansion. Abigail heard it though. I saw her flinch when the bedroom heater clanged at 2 a.m. 3 deliberate strikes like someone testing to see if we were listening. Matthew never looked surprised by any of it. He sat cross-legged on the floor near the warmest register, his face calm and his eyes half closed, like he was waiting for something he already knew was coming. The water stopped on a Thursday. I turned the kitchen faucet and got a cough of air. Then nothing. I tried the bathroom. Same thing. Dad checked every tap in the apartment, then stood in the hallway with his ear against the wall, listening to the pipes. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he straightened up and said, "The city supply has been poisoned." Abigail looked at me from the couch. Her face was pale. She'd been getting thinner, and I didn't know if it was the rationing or something else. "How do you know?" I asked. Dad turned. His eyes were red-rimmed, and I realized he hadn't slept in days. Maybe longer. "Because they told us it would happen. The radio said the water would fail when the treatment plants were abandoned." I hadn't heard that broadcast, but I didn't argue. We had bottled water in the pantry, enough for maybe a week if we were careful. Dad measured it out in plastic cups, one per meal, and told us not to waste it on washing. The apartment got dirtier, dishes piled up in the sink. The smell from the bathroom vent got stronger, and every night I heard the heaters clanging in Matthew's rhythm. On the fourth day, the water came back. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. A shudder in the pipes, then a hiss, then a low gurgling sound that rose through the walls. I turned the faucet and clear water poured out. Fast and cold. I let it run over my hand and felt relief so sharp it almost hurt. Dad came in behind me. He stared at the stream, then cupped his hands and drank. I didn't think. I did the same. The water tasted fine. Maybe a little metallic, like pennies, and there was a faint smell underneath that reminded me of the beach. But it was water, and we'd been rationing for days, and I drank until my stomach felt tight. Abigail came in and drank too. She filled a cup and held it with both hands, sipping slowly, and I saw her shoulders relax for the first time in a week. Matthew stood in the doorway and watched us. He didn't come closer. He didn't ask for water. He just looked at the three of us with that flat, patient expression, and then he turned and went back to his room. That should have told me something. The sickness started that night. I woke up around 3 a.m. with my stomach cramping so hard I thought something inside me had torn. I made it to the bathroom and threw up into the toilet, and what came out wasn't food. It was black. Gray-black, thick and gritty, and it left a stain on the porcelain that looked like soot. I heard Dad in the hallway. He was vomiting too, bent over the kitchen sink, and the sound was wet and wrong. Abigail stumbled out of her room and collapsed beside me. She gripped the edge of the bathtub and heaved, and the fluid that came out of her was the same color. It smelled like rust and seawater and something chemical I couldn't place. We were sick for days. I don't know how many. Time folded in on itself. I remember lying on the bathroom floor with my cheek against the cold tile. I remember Dad trying to stand and falling. I remember Abigail crying in her room, and the sound of her voice was different, thicker, like something was caught in her throat. Matthew brought us water, the same water that had made us sick, but we were too weak to refuse. He set plastic cups beside us without speaking, and I drank because my mouth tasted like metal and ash. Abigail's fever lasted the longest. She stopped getting up. She lay in her bed with the blankets pulled to her chin, and her skin looked gray in the dim light. I tried to sit with her, but I couldn't stay upright for more than a few minutes. Everything hurt. My teeth, my joints, my wrists. I looked down once and saw dark bruises circling both of them, like someone had gripped me hard enough to leave marks. I didn't remember anyone touching me. Then I lost 2 days. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, just gone. I have flashes, the bathroom mirror, Dad's voice, low and steady, praying or reciting something. the sound of metal scraping against concrete. But nothing connects. It's like someone pulled those hours out of my head and left the edges ragged. When I woke up, I was on the couch. My mouth tasted like blood. I ran my tongue over my teeth and felt a crack in one of the molars, sharp enough to cut. My wrists throbbed. The bruises had darkened to deep purple, and when I pressed them, the pain spiked so hard my vision blurred. I stood up. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. I walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. The mirror was shattered, not broken outward, like someone had punched it. Broken inward. The cracks radiated from a central impact point, and shards of glass lay on the floor and in the sink. I stared at the pattern and realized it looked like something had struck the mirror from the other side. From inside, I heard footsteps behind me. Dad. He stood in the doorway, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken. He looked at the mirror, then at me. "No one remembers," he said, "because the bad air tried to enter our minds." I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but he was already turning away. In the living room, Matthew sat cross-legged beside the baseboard heater. His eyes were half closed, and his fingers moved in slow taps against the metal fins. The heater answered. 3 clangs, a pause, 2 more. Somewhere else in the apartment, another heater echoed the pattern. The apartment smelled different now. Warm dust and old seawater. It clung to the walls, the furniture, the air itself. No matter how many times I opened the pantry or moved through the hallway, the smell stayed. Matthew opened his eyes and looked at me. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then he went back to tapping. I walked to the bathroom and stood in front of the broken mirror. My reflection stared back at me in fractured pieces. Thin face, hollow cheeks, bruises circling both wrists like cuffs. I lifted my hands and turned them slowly, watching the dark marks shift under the fluorescent light. I didn't know what had happened during those missing days, but I knew Matthew did. Abigail's throat swelled months after the fever. I noticed it first when she turned her head to drink from a jar of water I'd set on her nightstand. The skin beneath her jaw looked tight, darker than the rest of her neck, and when she swallowed, the motion seemed wrong, like something inside was moving against the direction it should. She didn't complain. She never did. A week later, the seam appeared. It ran vertically from just below her chin to the hollow of her throat, dark and flexible, like the slit in a speaker cone. I saw it when she lifted her chin to braid her hair. The edges didn't bleed. They just sat there, slightly parted, moving with her pulse. "Abby," I said. She lowered her chin fast and pulled a towel around her neck. "It's fine," she said. Her voice came out in 2 layers. The first was hers, weak and breathy. The second followed half a beat behind, deeper, flatter, repeating the last word like an echo that had learned to speak. "Fine." I stepped back. She didn't look at me. "Does it hurt?" I asked. "No." "No." She tied the towel tighter and turned toward the wall. I left her room and went to find Dad. He was kneeling beside the hallway speaker with his ear pressed against the metal grill. I could hear static coming through, broken by low tones that might have been words or might have been the building's pipes settling. "Dad," I said. He held up one hand without looking at me. "Abby's sick," I said. "Something's wrong with her throat." He lowered his hand and stood. His face was gaunt, his eyes red from lack of sleep or too much prayer or both. "Show me," he said. We went back to Abigail's room. She was sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap, the towel still wrapped around her neck. Dad crossed the room and knelt in front of her. "Let me see," he said. She hesitated, then unwound the towel. Dad stared at the seam for a long time. He reached out and touched the edge of it with 2 fingers. Abigail flinched, but didn't pull away. The seam flexed slightly under his touch, and I heard a faint hum, like feedback from a microphone held too close to a speaker. Dad pulled his hand back and stood. "Abigail has been made into a vessel because she was obedient," he said. He said it to me, not to her. Abigail looked down at her hands. For a moment I thought she might cry, but instead she nodded once, slow and deliberate, like she'd been expecting this. "It's a blessing," Dad said. "The faithful are chosen to carry the voice when the sealed time ends." I stared at him. He wasn't looking at either of us anymore. He was looking past us, toward the wall, like he could see something we couldn't. "She needs a doctor," I said. "There are no doctors," Dad said. "The hospital's closed months ago. You heard the broadcast. Then we open the door and take her to Anchorage." He turned on me fast. "Do not speak about the door," he said. His voice was low and sharp, the kind that used to make me stop asking questions when I was younger. But I was 18 now, and Abigail had a slit in her throat that hummed when you touched it. "Look at her," I said. "I am looking," Dad said, "and I see what you refuse to see. She has been marked. She will speak when the time comes." He left the room. I heard him return to the hallway speaker, muttering something I couldn't make out. Abigail wrapped the towel back around her neck. "It's fine," she said. "Fine." I sat down beside her on the bed. She didn't look at me. "Do you believe him?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely a whisper, and the second voice didn't follow. "I don't know," she said. That was the last time she answered a question for weeks. After that, she stopped talking unless she had to. She sat on her bed with towels layered around her neck, changing them when they got damp from sweat, or when the seam leaked a thin, clear fluid that smelled faintly of copper. She flinched whenever Matthew walked past her door. Once I saw her pull the towel so tight I thought she might strangle herself, and when I asked if she was okay, she just shook her head and turned toward the wall. I started noticing other things, small things that didn't fit. There was blood on the edge of the service panel behind the washing machine. Not a lot, just a smear along the metal frame. Brown and old, but still visible if you knelt down and looked close. I ran my fingers over it and felt the rough texture of dried blood mixed with something else. Something grainy, like dust or ash. I thought about the missing days after the fever. I thought about waking up with bruises on my wrists and a cracked molar, and no memory of how I'd gotten either. I thought about Abigail's throat and the way Dad had touched the seam like he'd seen it before. He'd taken her to the panel. During the fever, when none of us could think straight, he'd opened it and brought her to whatever was on the other side. Either the voice had told him to, or he'd done it on his own to prove he was faithful enough to sacrifice his daughter. I didn't ask him. I didn't ask Abigail either, because I already knew she wouldn't answer. Matthew started coming into the kitchen more often. He'd sit on the counter near the pantry and watch me divide the remaining food into daily portions. He didn't say much, but he smiled sometimes, the kind of smile that made my hands shake. One afternoon I was cleaning one of Abigail's towels in the bathroom sink when Matthew appeared in the doorway. "She's almost ready," he said. I turned off the water. "Get out," I said. He tilted his head. "You cleaned Joey's blood too," he said. You're good at cleaning. I grabbed the towel and pushed past him into the hallway. He didn't move out of the way. I had to turn sideways to get by. And as I did, he whispered something I couldn't quite hear. When I looked back, he was gone. Abigail started flinching every time Matthew came near her room. She'd pull the towel tighter and press herself against the wall, and if he stepped inside, she'd make a sound, low and choked, like she was trying to scream, but couldn't get the air out. I started keeping Matthew away from her. I'd block the doorway, or send him to the pantry, or ask him to help me with something in the other room. It didn't always work. He was small and quiet and good at appearing in places I hadn't seen him go. Dad stopped keeping track of the rations. I'd find half-burned cans of salmon on the camp stove, the food blackened and stuck to the metal. He'd forget to turn the stove off, and twice I came into the kitchen to find the burner still lit, the blue flame hissing in the dark. He spent hours at the hallway speaker, sometimes kneeling, sometimes standing with both hands pressed flat against the wall on either side of the grill. He'd mutter questions I couldn't make out, then wait in silence like he was listening for an answer. Sometimes he'd nod. Sometimes he'd argue, his voice rising until it cracked. One night he turned and looked at me like he didn't recognize me. "You sound like her," he said. "Like who?" "Deborah," he said. "You sound just like her when you ask questions." I didn't answer. He stared at me for another few seconds, then turned back to the speaker. I became the one who kept the apartment running. I cleaned Abigail's towels and hung them to dry over the shower rod. I repaired leaks in the plumbing with duct tape and plumber's putty from the pantry. I divided the food into portions that would last another month, then another, then another, because the 1,290 days were almost over and nothing had changed. I kept Matthew away from Abigail as much as I could, though I knew it wouldn't be enough. The apartment smelled like dust and old seawater, and something else I couldn't name, something warm and metallic that clung to the back of my throat. The 1,990th day came on a Thursday. I knew because I'd been counting in the margins of an old paperback, 1 mark per day, grouped into weeks. Dad had marked the day on the calendar he kept beside the hallway speaker. He'd circled it in red marker and written "Deliverance" in block letters across the square. I woke up that morning and went to the kitchen. Dad was already awake, kneeling beside the speaker with his hands folded. The radio was on, tuned to the No A station, but it was only playing static. Abigail stayed in her room. Matthew sat on the couch in the living room, watching the hallway. Nothing happened. The sun came up behind the plywood and filled the cracks with thin lines of light. The static on the radio didn't change. The speaker stayed silent except for the faint hum it always made, like current running through a wire that wasn't quite connected. Dad stayed by the speaker all day. He didn't eat. He didn't pray out loud. He just knelt there, waiting. By evening, I knew he was going to break. I brought him a jar of water and set it on the floor beside him. He didn't look at it. "Dad," I said. He didn't answer. "It's over," I said. "The day's almost done." He turned his head slowly and looked at me. His eyes were red and wet. "I miscalculated," he said. "What?" "The days," he said. "I didn't account for the leap years, or the Jewish months, or the daylight Alaska loses in winter. The count was wrong." I stared at him. "How many days was it supposed to be?" He didn't answer. He turned back to the speaker and pressed his forehead against the wall. The radio crackled. The static broke into a voice, low and flat, the same one that had been announcing plagues and closures and death tolls for months. Anchorage hospitals report new variant quarantine procedures, the voice said. Tunnel access restricted pending federal review. Whittier residents are advised to maintain sealed residences until further notice. Federal order remains in effect. Unauthorized entry into sealed residences will be met with lethal force. Dad lifted his head. See, he said. It's not over. The trial continues. He stood and went to the pantry. I heard him moving bins, tearing open a cardboard box. When he came back, he was holding a black marker. He knelt beside the storage bins stacked along the kitchen wall and started writing over the old labels. He crossed out 1090 and wrote 1367 in its place. Then he moved to the next bin and did the same. The radio kept talking. Sealed residences must remain closed, it said. Maintain internal air filtration. Do not open doors or windows. Federal enforcement active in Whittier, Portage, and Girdwood. Dad wrote the new number on every bin, every jar, every box. His hand shook, but he didn't stop. I watched him from the doorway. Abigail's towels were still drying over the shower rod. Matthew was still on the couch, smiling at nothing. The radio repeated the order to keep sealed residences closed. Dad kept writing. The lights died at 6:43. I knew the time because I'd been watching the digital clock on the hand crank radio, counting down the minutes until Dad would recalculate again. The storm had been building all afternoon, wind hammering sleet against the plywood. And when the power cut, the apartment went black so fast, I thought I'd blinked wrong. Then I saw the red glow coming from Matthew's room. It pulsed through the baseboard heater like a dying emergency light. Faint, but steady. The rest of the apartment was cold and dark, but Matthew's room glowed like something underground. Dad stumbled past me in the hallway, hands out, feeling for walls. The generator, he said. The building generator should. It didn't. The cold came next. Without the space heater, the temperature dropped fast. I could feel it sinking through the floor, creeping up the walls, turning the air sharp enough to hurt. Along the window wall, the canned food we'd stacked in cardboard boxes started to freeze. I heard the cans cracking, one by one, like knuckles popping in the dark. The hand crank radio slowed to a whine, then stopped. Dad tried winding it, but his hands shook too hard to grip the handle. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and turned it on. The beam cut through the dark and landed on Abigail's door. It was open. She stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, the other clutching a towel around her neck. Her face was gray. Her eyes were too wide. She was making a sound I'd never heard before, high and wet, like something trying to breathe through water. Then the towel fell. The seam under her jaw was open, not bleeding, just open. It flexed like a speaker cone, the edges dark and smooth, and when it moved, I heard words coming out that weren't hers. Tunnel closed. Her mouth didn't move. The words came from the seam, low and flat, the same voice that had been on the radio for months. Air unclean. Abigail clawed at her own throat, trying to close it, but the seam kept opening. Remain sealed. Dad fell to his knees, not collapsing. Kneeling, he pressed both palms to the floor and started praying, his voice loud and cracked. The trial has reached its last hour, the final test. The faithful will endure. The faithful will. I stopped listening. I understood now. The voices weren't warning us about the outside. They were using Abigail because the building speaker was dead and the radios were losing power. She was the last transmitter they had. I turned toward the front door, flashlight in hand, but something moved in the dark hallway ahead of me. Matthew. He stood just outside the beam, holding Dad's spare screwdriver in one hand. The red glow from his room lit him from behind, turning his outline soft and wrong. He didn't blink when the light hit his face. "Leave Abigail alone," he said. His voice was calm, flat. "She's almost loud enough." I didn't move. "Joey was too small," Matthew said. "Deborah fought too hard. Abigail will let the whole building hear when the seals open inside her." Behind him, Abigail made that wet choking sound again. I looked past Matthew and saw her on her knees now, both hands around her throat, the seam opening wider. I thought about Joey's fingernails packed with gray dust. I thought about Deborah's coat in the trash bag. I thought about staying here until Abigail became the wall's voice permanently, until the apartment ate all of us the way it had eaten them. I backed away from Matthew, turned, and went to Dad. He was still on his knees, still praying, his face wet and his hands shaking. I crouched beside him. "Dad." He didn't stop. "Dad, listen to me." His eyes snapped to mine, wild, desperate. I kept my voice steady. "The only way to prove the world is dead is to open the door and look." He stared at me like I'd spoken a language he didn't know. Then Abigail spoke again. Not the announcer voice. Not hers either. Mom's. "Aiden!" Dad's whole body went rigid. "Why did you put me in the wall?" The seam under Abigail's jaw moved with every word, but the voice was perfect. Mom's exact tone. The way she used to say his name when she was too tired to fight. Dad broke. He tore the key from the cord around his neck, shoved it into my hand, and grabbed one end of the steel bar across the door. "Help me," he said. I grabbed the other end. Matthew screamed. Not the calm, watchful voice he'd been using for months. A child's scream, high and panicked and real. The hallway speaker roared. It shouldn't have been working. The power was out. But it roared anyway, pouring sound into the apartment so loud the wall shook. Emergency alerts layered over scripture, layered over Mom's sobs, layered over Joey scratching at the closet door, layered over the fake No AA announcer, saying, "Remain sealed, remain sealed, remain sealed," in a voice that sounded like 10 radios playing at once. I lifted the bar free. The door rattled in its frame, the rubber stripping, peeling back, the lock straining. I shoved the key into the lock. My hands were shaking. The key scraped metal. The noise from the speaker got louder, louder, until I thought my ears would split. I turned the key. The lock turned. The bar lifted. Light spilled in. I blinked against it. Fluorescent. Ordinary. Hallway light from bulbs that had never stopped working, that had burned every night while we counted days in the dark. A woman stood in front of me. She wore slippers and held a trash bag in one hand. Her mouth hung open. She stared at me like I was a ghost. "I thought," she started, then stopped. "I thought this apartment was empty." Behind her, the hallway stretched toward the stairwell. I could see the carpet, worn but clean. The air smelled like coffee, like laundry detergent, like winter coming in through a building that breathed with the world instead of against it. Somewhere below us, a dog barked. I looked past the woman. There were no bodies in the hall. No soldiers, no poisoned fog, no dead town. The radios behind me went silent. The hallway speaker made a sound like metal tearing, then died. Smoke curled from the grill. Abigail fell. I caught her before her head hit the floor. The towel around her neck slipped, and I saw the seam under her jaw. It had stopped moving. It looked like scar tissue now, dark and still, but it did not close. Dad stepped into the hallway. He looked at the woman, at the light, at the carpet that had been there the whole time. Then he dropped to his knees and sobbed. "I saved them," he said. I saved them. The woman backed away. She looked at me, at Abigail in my arms, at Dad kneeling in the doorway. Then she ran. Stay with her, I told Dad. He did not answer. He rocked forward with his hands over his face. I laid Abigail down and turned back toward the apartment. Matthew had not followed us into the hall. Toby? The apartment was dark. The plywood still covered the windows from the inside, and the only light came from the red glow pulsing through the baseboard heater in his room. I stepped back through the doorway. My eyes adjusted. Matthew stood beside the washing machine. The service panel behind it was open. I had never seen it open before tonight, except for the night we lost Joey. The apartment smelled like warm dust and seawater. Toby, come on, we're leaving. He looked at me. His face was calm. He raised one hand, not to wave goodbye, but like he was listening to someone above him, like someone in the concrete core was calling his name. Then he turned and climbed into the maintenance void feet first. I lunged for him. My hand caught air. He slid down into the dark, his shoulders disappearing, then his head, then his raised hand. Something pulled him. Not gravity, something else. I reached into the void. My fingers scraped concrete and old conduit. The space was too narrow for me to follow. I called his name until my throat burned, but the only answer was a faint metallic hum from somewhere deep in the building's core. Footsteps pounded in the hallway. Voices shouted. Hands pulled me back from the panel. 2 police officers came through the door first. One of them was tall, with gray in his hair and a nameplate that read Carver. The other was younger, stocky, with Ortega on his vest. They moved through the apartment with flashlights, checking rooms, calling for anyone else inside. Carver stopped at the closet. He opened it. I saw his jaw tighten. Firefighters arrived next. They carried crowbars and a portable light that turned the living room white. One of them started prying the plywood off the windows. The nails screamed coming out. Paramedics knelt beside Abigail. One of them wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and checked her pulse. The other looked at her throat, then looked at his partner. Neither of them said anything. Ortega pulled Dad to his feet and cuffed his hands behind his back. Dad did not resist. He stared at the carpet like he was trying to remember what it meant. Carver came over to me. He crouched so we were at the same height. How many of you were in here? He asked. 5, I said. Me, my sister, my dad, and my 2 brothers. Where are your brothers? I pointed at the closet. Then I pointed at the washing machine. Carver stood. He spoke into his radio. More people came. They took pictures of the closet, the service panel, the dead speaker in the hallway. One of them found Mom's driver's license inside Dad's Bible. Another found gray dust smeared on the edge of the washing machine panel. They took Dad out first. He looked back at me once. His face was empty. They took Abigail next. The paramedics carried her on a stretcher. She opened her eyes when they lifted her, and she looked at me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Carver stayed with me while they cleared the apartment. He asked questions. I answered the ones I could. When I told him about the broadcasts, he wrote it down without commenting. When I told him about the water, he wrote that down too. Your mother, he said. Deborah Miles. Your father said she died in 2018. That's what he told us. Carver closed his notebook. She didn't die. She's been looking for you since your father took you to Whittier. I stared at him. She filed reports in Anchorage, he said. Kept filing them even after the case went cold. She'll want to see you. They took me to Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage the next morning. The tunnel was open. Traffic moved through it like it always had. I watched the harbor lights fade behind us as we drove into the mountain. Abigail was in surgery when I arrived. A doctor told me they were removing damaged tissue from her throat. He did not explain the second voice. He did not explain the seam. The official report, when it came, blamed confinement, abuse, contaminated stored water, and carbon monoxide from improper stove use. It did not explain why the disconnected hallway speaker had melted from the inside. Mom arrived the morning after Abigail's surgery. I was sitting in the waiting room when she walked in. I recognized her before she recognized me. 4 years inside the sealed apartment had made me thin, pale, and older than 18 should look. She stopped in the doorway, her mouth opened. Then she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me, and I felt her shaking. "Leif," she said. "Oh God, Leif." I had not heard my real name in 4 years. Firefighters searched baggage towers for Matthew. They checked the laundry chases, the stairwells, the elevator machinery areas. They opened every service panel they could access. The vertical void behind the washing machine narrowed into sealed concrete and old conduit, too tight for a child's body. They found nothing. Building maintenance workers replaced the burned speaker and welded the apartment service panel shut. No one in Whittier admitted hearing the fake broadcasts, except Aurora Rice. She found me one afternoon outside Providence and told me she had sometimes heard a child laughing through her heater at night. She had thought it was a recording. She had thought a lot of things. She did not ask what happened to Matthew. I think she already knew. After Dad was taken away and Abigail stabilized, I went back to the apartment once. Mom came with me. Officer Ortega opened the door and let us in. The plywood was gone from the windows. Daylight filled the apartment for the first time in nearly 4 years. It looked smaller than I remembered. The pantry shelves were half empty. The hallway smelled like disinfectant instead of dust. I walked to the baseboard heater where Matthew had first whispered into the wall. I switched it off with my own hand. The metal fins ticked as they cooled. Then they went silent. Mom's box of paperbacks sat beside the door where the firefighters had stacked salvageable belongings. I picked it up. The cardboard was soft with age, but the books inside were still dry. I looked back once. The apartment was just an apartment. 4 rooms and a kitchen. Windows that opened. A door that locked from the inside. I stepped into the hallway. Mom followed. Officer Ortega pulled the door shut behind us, and the lock clicked into place. The hallway stretched toward the stairwell. Ordinary light. Ordinary air. I carried the box toward the elevator and did not look back again.